The patient in room 4. My name is Andrew Simmons, and I'm 30 years old. I work as a night security guard at Mercy General Hospital in a small town in Arkansas. And the night I found out that some people will use a thunderstorm as cover for the darkest intentions is the night I stopped trusting that hospitals are places of healing. Before I begin, if you work at night anywhere in any capacity, just make sure you know all the exits. Keep listening, because what happened that August night made me understand that danger doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it wears a worried face and carries a hospital ID. My job was straightforward. I worked from 11 at night until 7 in the morning. I walked the hallways. I checked the doors. I made sure nothing was stolen. I kept the peace during the hours when most normal people were sleeping. It was a quiet job most nights. The hospital had maybe 80 beds, but usually only about 40 or so were occupied. The night shift was always the slowest shift. Fewer visitors, fewer emergencies. Mostly just patients sleeping and nurses doing their rounds, and me walking the corridors making sure everything was secure. Wednesday night started like any other night. I came in at 10:55, clocked in, checked the security monitors. Everything looked normal. The entrance was locked. The medication storage was secure. The emergency room had a couple of people waiting, but nothing serious. The nurses told me it had been a quiet evening. I said good. Quiet meant I could do my rounds without incident. I said I'd make a full circuit every hour and to call me if anything came up. They said, okay. I started my first round at 11:15. I walked from the main entrance toward the intensive care unit. The hallway was lit by soft lights designed not to disturb sleeping patients. The walls were that standard hospital color, that pale beige that's supposed to be calming, but mostly just feels institutional. I passed several rooms where I could see patients sleeping, monitors beeping softly, respirators humming, the familiar sounds of a hospital at night. Nothing unusual, nothing that made me concerned. By the time I got to the emergency room to check on the situation there, the number of waiting patients had increased slightly. A man had come in with chest pain. A woman had come in with what might have been a broken wrist. Standard emergency room stuff. I nodded to the nurse and continued my rounds. The weather report I'd heard earlier had mentioned a thunderstorm moving in, but the sky hadn't darkened much yet. The wind hadn't picked up. I figured the storm was still maybe an hour or two away. I finished my first complete circuit at 11:55. Everything was locked. Everything was secure. I went back to the security office, a small room near the main entrance, where we had monitors showing feeds from the cameras throughout the hospital. I sat down at the desk. I looked at the screens. I monitored a couple of the hallways, watched for any movement, any activity. Nothing. Just the quiet hospital doing its business. I checked my phone. No messages, no alerts. Just another night. Around 1 in the morning, the rain started. I could hear it from inside the security office. The sound of water hitting the roof. Gentle at first, then heavier. By 1:30, the rain had become substantial. By 2 o'clock, it was torrential. The kind of rain that sounds like thousands of tiny hammers hitting the building. I could see lightning flashing through the small window of the security office. The thunder came close behind, shaking the structure slightly. I wasn't concerned. Hospitals are built to handle weather. The backup generators were in place. The phone lines were hardwired. There was no real danger from a thunderstorm. I continued my routine. Every hour I did a full circuit. I checked the doors. I checked the windows. I made sure everything was still secure. The storm outside was intense, but inside the hospital nothing changed. Nothing was different. Around 3:15 in the morning, I was back in the security office when I got a call from the front desk nurse. She said there was someone in the lobby asking to see a patient. I asked her who it was. She said it was a man claiming to be the son of a patient in room 4. She said the patient's name was Robert Halloway. She said the man was soaking wet from the rain and looked distraught. She asked if I could come up to the lobby and talk to him. I said I would. I locked up the security office and made my way to the main lobby. The elevator took me up one floor. When the doors opened, I could see the man standing near the front desk. He was indeed soaking wet. His hair was plastered to his head. His clothes were dripping water onto the linoleum floor. He looked genuinely upset. When he saw me, he approached immediately. He said his name was David Halloway. He said he was Robert Halloway's son. He said he'd driven to the hospital because his mother had called him and said his father had taken a turn for the worse. He said he'd been driving through the storm, and it had been terrifying. He said he wanted to go see his father right away. He said it was urgent. I told him it was 3 in the morning, and visiting hours weren't until 9. I said emergency visits were only for immediate family, and only in certain circumstances. I asked the nurse if Robert Halloway had a son. The nurse checked the chart. She said, yes, Robert Halloway did have a son, but she didn't have any information about an emergency situation. She said his vital signs had been stable when she checked on him about an hour ago. She said she could call the doctor if he wanted, but she didn't think there was a medical emergency. The man looked frustrated. He said his mother had specifically told him to come. He said it was important. He said he needed to see his father now. Something about the way he said it made me uncomfortable. I couldn't put my finger on exactly what, but something felt off. His desperation seemed exaggerated. His insistence seemed stronger than someone who just received a concerning call from their mother. I told him I understood his concern, but the hospital had visiting hours for a reason. I said I could have someone check on his father and report back to him. I said he could wait in the lobby. He didn't like that answer. He said he needed to see his father personally. He said he couldn't just stand in the lobby while his father was upstairs, possibly dying. His voice was getting louder. The nurse was watching us carefully. The man was making a scene. I decided to check with the doctor on call. I said if the doctor approved, I'd let him go see his father for a few minutes. The man said, okay. He calmed down slightly. I told the nurse to call Dr. Patterson in the medical ward. I said to explain the situation. The nurse made the call. She talked quietly into the phone. She waited for a response. Then she hung up and told me the doctor said it was fine to let him visit his father for 10 minutes, but only if hospital security escorted him. I said I would. I told the man to follow me. As I was leading him toward the elevator, something caught my eye. In the security monitors mounted on the wall near the front desk, I could see other areas of the hospital. And in one of the monitors showing the hallway near the intensive care unit, I saw movement. Someone moving quickly. Someone who wasn't supposed to be there. I stopped walking. I looked more carefully at the monitor. The figure was moving along the intensive care hallway. They seemed to be looking at room numbers, looking for something, looking for someone. And my first instinct was that this man I was escorting, this man claiming to be David Halloway, was somehow connected to whatever was happening in the ICU. I made a decision. I told the man I needed to handle something quickly, and that I'd be right back. I told him to have a seat in the lobby. I told the nurse to keep an eye on him. The man looked annoyed, but he sat down. I walked quickly back toward the security office. I wanted to get a better look at the monitors. I wanted to see who was moving around in the ICU and what they were doing. When I got to the security office, I pulled up the ICU camera feeds on the main monitor. The person I'd seen was still there. They were moving down the hallway, stopping at each room, looking at the door numbers. They were wearing dark clothes. They had dark hair. They were moving with purpose. And then they stopped. They stopped in front of a specific room. Room 4. The room where Robert Holloway was supposed to be. My heart rate increased. The man in the lobby had claimed to be Robert Holloway's son. He'd wanted to go to room 4. And at the exact same moment, someone else was in the hallway, moving toward the same room. Either this was an incredible coincidence, or this was coordinated. This was planned. And I was standing here in the security office while potentially dangerous people were moving through my hospital. I picked up the phone. I tried to call the police, but the line was dead. The storm must have knocked out the phone line. I tried again. Nothing. I looked at the security system. I could make calls on the internal hospital phone system, but not outside. I was cut off. The storm outside had isolated us, and now there were people in the hospital doing things they shouldn't be doing. I made another decision. I left the security office. I went back up to the lobby where I'd left the man claiming to be David Holloway. He was still sitting where I'd told him to sit. The nurse was at the front desk doing paperwork. I approached the man and I told him I was sorry, but visiting hours were extremely strict, and the doctor had called back to say there was nothing seriously wrong with his father. I said he was welcome to visit in the morning during regular visiting hours. I said, given the severity of the storm, I thought he should go home and come back in daylight. The man looked angry. He said that was unacceptable. He said he needed to see his father now. He was standing up. His hands were clenched. And I was suddenly very certain that this man was not actually Robert Holloway's son. This was someone who had other intentions. Someone who was being coordinated with the person I'd seen in the ICU hallway. I told the man firmly that visiting hours were over and that he needed to leave. I told him I would escort him out if necessary. He stared at me for a long moment. I could see him calculating something, deciding something. And then he said fine. He said he'd come back in the morning. He walked toward the entrance. The main entrance doors opened automatically for him, and he stepped out into the storm. The rain poured in briefly before the doors closed. And then he was gone. I immediately went back to the security monitors. I wanted to see what was happening in the ICU now, but the camera feed showed nothing. The person I'd seen was no longer in the hallway. I checked other cameras. I scanned the entire ICU area. Nothing. Whoever had been moving around in there was either in a room or had moved somewhere else. I made another call on the internal phone system. I called the ICU nurses station. A nurse answered. I asked if everything was okay up there. The nurse said yes, everything was fine. I asked if anyone had tried to access a patient's room. The nurse said, no, it was quiet. No one had come to the unit. I asked her to check on the patients in rooms 1 through 5. I said I wanted to make sure everyone was accounted for and safe. The nurse asked what was wrong. I said probably nothing. I just wanted to be sure. The nurse put me on hold. I waited for about 2 minutes. Then she came back. She said all the patients in rooms 1 through 5 were accounted for. All their monitors showed normal vital signs. Room 4 Robert Holloway was sleeping peacefully. Everything looked fine. I hung up. But something still felt wrong. I went back to the security office. I watched the cameras more carefully. I watched every hallway. I watched the stairwells. I watched the exits. For the next 3 hours, until dawn started to break, I watched every inch of the hospital that the cameras could see. And I saw nothing suspicious. I saw nurses doing their rounds. I saw the occasional patient getting up to use the bathroom. I saw orderlies moving equipment. Everything looked normal. But then around 6 in the morning, I saw something on the pharmacy camera feed that made my blood go cold. The pharmacy door was open. Someone was inside. Someone who was not authorized to be inside the pharmacy at 6 in the morning. I could see them moving around. They were putting things in a bag. They were stealing medication. I immediately called the ICU again. I told the nurse that there was an unauthorized person in the pharmacy and that she should lock down the unit. I told her not to let anyone in or out until I gave the all clear. She started to ask questions, but I told her it was urgent. She said, "Okay." They were locking it down. I grabbed my radio. I left the security office and headed toward the pharmacy. The pharmacy is on the first floor near the back of the hospital. I moved quickly but carefully, staying alert, watching for any signs of the thief. When I got to the pharmacy door, I found it slightly ajar. I could see someone inside. A woman this time. Not the man from the lobby. This was a different person. She was stuffing bottles of pills into a bag. I pushed the door open. I identified myself as hospital security. The woman looked up, startled. She was in her 30s with blonde hair pulled back and a ponytail. For a moment, we just looked at each other. Then she bolted. She ran toward the back of the pharmacy. There was another door back there that led to an external hallway. She was trying to escape. I pursued her. I wasn't trained for combat, but I was trained in basic pursuit and restraint. She ran down the hallway. She ran toward the emergency exit. She pushed through the door and into the storm. The rain was still heavy. The wind was still strong. But she was running. She was running toward the parking lot. I followed her out into the storm. The rain immediately soaked me. The wind pushed against me. But I kept running. I could see her ahead of me running toward a dark sedan parked in the lot. She reached the car and opened the driver's side door. The engine started. The car began to move, but then something happened that stopped her. Police lights appeared. A police cruiser pulled into the parking lot from the street. 2 officers jumped out. One ran toward the dark sedan. One ran toward me. The officer who approached me asked if I was okay. I said yes, I was fine. I pointed toward the sedan. I said that car was the one. The officer went to help the other officer apprehend the woman. It turned out that the man in the lobby, the man claiming to be David Holloway, had been stopped by the police about a mile from the hospital. They'd pulled him over because of the storm and because he was driving erratically. When they ran his ID, they'd found out he had outstanding warrants. They had arrested him. While processing him, he'd mentioned the hospital. Mentioned that he had a friend who was in the hospital right now, doing something important. The police had gotten concerned. They'd called the hospital. They'd gotten the front desk. The front desk had put them on with me. That's when I'd told them about the woman in the pharmacy and the man I'd seen on the camera. The police had sent a unit to the hospital. They'd arrived just in time to catch the woman as she was trying to flee. It turned out the 2 of them were part of a prescription drug theft ring. They'd been targeting hospitals and pharmacies across 3 states. The man would come in pretending to be a family member. He would distract security. While I was dealing with him, his accomplice would break in through a secondary entrance and steal high-value medications. Opioids, benzodiazepines, medications that were worth thousands of dollars on the street. Robert Holloway, the patient in room 4, wasn't even the reason they were here. They had no connection to him. They'd just chosen room 4 randomly. The man in the lobby had given a name that happened to match an actual patient, but he'd never even met him. It was coincidence. Or maybe they'd researched the hospital ahead of time and chosen names from public records. Either way, it had worked. They'd gotten into the hospital. And if I hadn't noticed something off, if I hadn't checked the cameras, they might have succeeded. The police officer told me that the woman in the sedan had approximately $15,000 worth of medications in her possession. He said I'd done the right thing by being suspicious. He said something about my instincts that I've never forgotten. He said most people don't trust their gut. Most people assume there's a logical explanation for the things that feel wrong. Most people assume that someone who seems genuine probably is. But he said, there are people in this world who are counting on that. People who are counting on you doubting yourself. People who are counting on you choosing politeness over safety. The hospital did a full security review after that. They hired additional personnel. They upgraded the camera systems. They added more locks to the sensitive areas. But for me, the damage was done. I'd learned that danger doesn't always look like danger. I'd learned that a man can show up at a hospital soaking wet and claiming to be someone's son, and he can seem genuine enough that you might let your guard down. I'd learned that a woman can break into a pharmacy and seem focused and purposeful and entirely believable in her criminal intent. For the rest of my time working at that hospital, which was another 2 years, I was hyper-vigilant. Every visitor got extra scrutiny. Every person who seemed slightly off got my attention. I probably inconvenienced some people. I probably seemed paranoid. But I never missed another security breach. The theft ring was caught because of my attention to detail that night. Because of the fact that I trusted my instincts. Because of the fact that when something felt wrong, I didn't ignore it. But here's what still bothers me about that night. Here's what keeps me up thinking about it even now. The man in the lobby, David Holloway, or whatever his real name was. He'd seemed genuinely distraught. He'd seemed genuinely concerned about his father. And his acting was so convincing that under different circumstances, I might have just let him walk up to the ICU. I might have escorted him myself. I might have stood there watching while he did whatever he and his accomplice were planning to do. And the scariest part is that I only caught him because I happened to glance at a monitor at exactly the right moment. Because I happened to see the other person in the hallway. Because I happened to notice something was off. But what if the cameras had been pointed differently? What if I'd been looking at a different monitor? What if I'd been in the bathroom instead of the security office when the alarm should have gone off? Hospitals are supposed to be places where you're safe. Places where people are there to help you. Places where the staff is trained to protect you. But that night, I learned that hospitals can be infiltrated by people with bad intentions. That the caring atmosphere that makes a hospital a healing place can also be exploited by people who are counting on that kindness to let their guard down. After I left that job, I worked in a different industry. I still work nights sometimes, But I'm not in a hospital anymore. But I carry that experience with me. I carry the understanding that not everyone is who they say they are. I carry the knowledge that your instincts, even when they seem to be telling you something that contradicts what you can see on the surface, are usually right. And I carry the gratitude for that moment when I glanced at a monitor and saw something that didn't belong. Because if I hadn't noticed that figure moving down the ICU hallway, if I hadn't made the decision to check the cameras more carefully, if I hadn't trusted my gut that something about the man in the lobby wasn't quite right, then Robert Holloway and all the other patients in that hospital might have had their medications stolen. They might have had their treatment interrupted. They might have suffered because of the actions of people who were willing to exploit a thunderstorm and the chaos it brings to get what they wanted. But the scariest part is this. The scariest part is that the man in the lobby was never caught doing anything overtly criminal. He was arrested on outstanding warrants from other cases, other thefts, other times his luck had run out. But if he'd chosen a different hospital, if he'd chosen a different night, if he'd chosen a time when the security was less vigilant, he would still be out there. He would still be plotting. He would still be showing up to hospitals soaking wet, claiming to be someone's son, and distracting security, while someone else stole the medications that people desperately needed. And I think about all the hospitals across this country, all the healthcare facilities, all the places where people go when they're vulnerable, when they need help, when they trust that they'll be safe. And I wonder how many of them have security like I did. How many of them have someone watching the cameras carefully? How many of them have someone willing to trust their instincts and act on them? And I wonder how many times someone like that man in the lobby has walked into a hospital somewhere and succeeded because no one was paying attention. Because no one thought to question a man with a convincing story and the right amount of desperation in his eyes. The thunderstorm that night wasn't just weather. It was a distraction. It was a tool. It was the cover that allowed bad people to do bad things. And I learned that night that safety is never guaranteed, even in places that are supposed to be safe, even when surrounded by people who are trained to help. Safety depends on people paying attention. Safety depends on people trusting their instincts. Safety depends on people being willing to question someone even when everything on the surface looks legitimate. So if you ever feel like something is off, if you ever get that feeling in your gut that something isn't right, trust it. Don't assume you're being paranoid. Don't assume you're overreacting. Don't assume that the person in front of you with a good story and the right words is telling the truth. Trust your instincts. Act on them. Because the difference between a successful crime and a prevented crime is often just one person paying attention. One person trusting what they see. One person willing to act. That night, I was that person. And I'm grateful I was paying attention. Because if I hadn't been a man who knew exactly how to manipulate a situation, would have succeeded again.